We're going to look at the history of what I would call producers' music, and talk about some of the dilemmas and implications of that. We're not going to talk about compression or equalization or acoustics. We're going to give you a day off from that, because I think what you do here, you have that pretty well covered. I'm going to play some music. We're going to look at some visuals, and yeah, in general, that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me as I'm going along. But I also, at the end, if there's any questions you want to talk about, we can do that. Just as way of introduction, I'll just say a few things about myself. I'm from grunge town, Seattle, Washington. I started playing music in the mid-'80s. For years I was in a band called Walkabouts. We made 15 albums. I toured pretty much all over the world with that group. What else? I've been producing for other artists basically for the last 15 years. And in that time I've done something like 30 albums for other artists. I don't really have any formal musical or engineering training. These days I do work as an engineer on some projects that I actually produce, but I don't come from any training. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, but it's the reality, you know. I learned what I learned as I went. My only formal degree is in philosophy, which you will now realize that after my lecture. So if you have no great love of philosophy, this is a good time to get up and leave. All other information, I read a great interview with Nick Cave recently, and the person was asking him about his early life, and he just kept saying Google it. So if you want to know more, you can Google it. I guess the first question is, what is a producer? And it seems like a silly question to ask, but in reality I think it's almost an impossible question to answer. I think that there's as many definitions of a producer as there are producers, as there are styles of music. The idea of the producer has changed really radically in modern music. I think we all know that. I mean, where you guys are coming from in this time is even crazily different than when I started making music in the 80s. I mean, we're already into a completely different era. I'm still part of this era now. I mean, I have my own studio. I make my own productions. At the studio, I also work in more traditional studio environments. So I sort of have one foot in both places. But it is really something that has evolved over the years. You know, sometimes I say to people, my definition of the producer, it's the guy in the room that there's no other name for, because it's really a hard thing to say. You know, the engineer is pretty clear, the artist is often clear, but again, in this more contemporary era, even that is starting to blur together. I mean, I think now, you know, if we talk about dance music and things like that, hip hop, and we're going to talk a lot about just the producer as the artist. You know, we really are in that era now. I mean, do you guys have any like ways you would define a producer? I mean, is there any like quick-handed, you know, definitions out there? I don't really know one, but if someone's got one, I'd love to hear it. Like I said, I think it changes on the context. It changes on, you know, each project you do. I mean, I know from the work I do as a producer, it really, you know, sometimes you're very heavy-handed, you're really involved. Sometimes you're in a room with people playing, and you're trying to stay out of the way. You're basically letting them do as much as they can do on their own, you know. And that really changes sometimes from artist to artist, project to project. It changes from day to day. You know, some days you're really involved. You know, and the history of producing is really quite an evolution. You know, in the 1950s, the producer was basically someone that worked for the record company. He's the person that set up the session. He was usually instructed to hire the musicians, but there was an employee of the record company. And until the mid-'60s, the producer sat behind the desk with the engineer, often commented mostly on the performance, because most music that was being made at that time was basically based around performance. A band in a room playing, microphone set up, that's how a record was made. The first Beatles record was made in one day. You know, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of jazz records that were made in 3 or 4 hours, and so on. I mean, that started to change really radically in the late 60s with records like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. You know, there started to be a more involved productions, but still the majority of people were still, you know, a band in a room. The late 60s to the 80s, the producer started to cross over into doing things that weren't necessarily related directly to performance. There was more manipulation of sound, creation of music. Like I saw somebody with a Pink Floyd t-shirt, you know, Dark Side of the Moon, a great example. You know, this was a record that couldn't have been made in 1962, but it could be made in 1974 or whenever it was made, somewhere around there. You know, this really became a radically different approach to making music. Also, artists started to become producers. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys did Pet Sounds. Brian Eno was a guy who played in Roxy Music. We're going to talk a lot about him later. He started to produce records. John Cale, who came out of the Velvet Underground, started to produce records for lots of artists like Iggy Pop and the Stooges, Patti Smith. By the 80s, we entered what I would call the era of the producer with a capital P. In hip hop and dance music, the producer actually becomes the artist. We don't have this line anymore. You know, it's like these words actually become more and more irrelevant. Produced by doesn't mean so much anymore, because a lot of music is actually the artist as the producer. And this is a radical, you know, reassessment of the whole thing. You know, in the past, the DJ used to only play records, and at some point, the DJ began to make the records that he or she played. And so this was a fundamental shift in the whole thing. There's a really good book written by a guy named Virgil Moorfield called The Producer as Composer, Shaping the Sounds of Popular Music. And this guy points out three different, what he calls defining aspects of modern production. Point one is that recording has gone from being primarily a technical matter to an artistic matter. And the technical matter in the past was capturing the performance, setting the mics in the right place, making sure that the right musicians were there. And now it's more about, you know, creating things from zero, you know, actually having the ideas, you know, being the artist. The second point that he makes is that modern production is, there's a metaphor shift. Basically, in the old days, the idea was that when we were recording things, we were trying to give people the illusion that this was a band playing in a room. I mean, often it was, but often it was an illusion. You know, there was that famous story about there's a Thin Lizzy live record from the late 70s that basically the only thing that is left from it is, I think, the kick drum from the live performance. You know, I mean, it was a complete, you know, it was a complete rebuild. They started with the guitars, then they went to the bass, and then it just didn't stop. You know, in the end, they had the kick drum. So, but it, you know, I think it's called Live and Dangerous. Yeah. And you know, it's selling the illusion that this is a band really sweating and pumping it out on stage. But of course, now we don't even bother with this illusion. You know, nobody thinks that a hip hop record is a bunch of guys sitting around in a room playing music. Maybe the Beastie Boys, but you know, for the most part, that's not. And we don't really care about that. And that's actually another really big fundamental shift in how we think about things. The third point is that the contemporary producer has become an auteur. So what does this French word mean? I mean, what is the definition of auteur? It's usually used in terms of filmmaking, and it's defined as a filmmaker whose individual style and complete control over all elements of production give a film its personal and unique stamp. So certainly producers like someone like Timbaland or something like that are auteurs. They sit behind the console, they move the knobs, they compose the material, they direct the videos, they probably go out with the women in the videos. You know, they're completely involved in every aspect of the production. And then also, because of the decentralization of recording technology, the availability of digital technology that everybody in this room, I assume, has to their own disposal, not just here, but personally. You know, there's kids, young people everywhere making garage, techno, two-step tracks in London or Shishka, and they are auteurs. They are involved in the whole aspect of the production from beginning to end. The distinction between the artist and the producer has completely collapsed, actually. And often when we now use these words, artist or producer, we actually now mean the same thing. So now I'm going to get to possibly the more interesting part of this lecture. We're going to look at some pictures and also listen to some music. Basically, I'm going to look at three different areas of, let's say, the history of production. Well, two different areas of the history and one case study of myself. We're going to look at Jamaican music from the early 70s and its development into what was called dub reggae. Then we're going to look at the work of an English producer, Brian Eno. And then I'm going to talk about a record that I made in Bamako, Mali, in West Africa last year, just to tie in some of these things we're talking about.